Okay, so let's see. Okay, so good good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Um, my name is Kerri Brown. I am part of the Writers Collective of Beers for Everyone. We are a grassroots media organization that focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in the craft beer industry. So let's see. Okay, so if anyone has comments, I'm able to see them on my side. I'm hoping that whoever is here, we can have an interactive conversation about my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions either during the presentation or after the presentation. So, so yeah, let's get started. So let me just introduce myself a little bit more. Like I said, I'm part of the Writers Collective for Beers for Everyone. I would say that my entrance into the craft beer world is kind of interesting. I love when people start out like that. It's different, it's interesting, but it was. So I actually have a doctorate in cultural anthropology, and my specialty is medical anthropology. So a lot of my work was with small grassroots collective of women who work with kind of artisan goods. And so I was doing research on public policies, on the artisan economy, and eventually, well, I was always a wine drinker. Eventually, I kind of got into beer. My research was always in Brazil, and so whenever I got to Brazil, like beer was all around me, and I had like no choice but to get into beer. And so at some point, I kind of married all of my interests. So I was really into craft beer. I was doing research on kind of these small collectives of women, and yeah, so then I kind of started to venture into women who are in the craft beer world in Brazil. Um, and so, go to the next slide. And so, yeah, so at some point with Beers for Everyone, and then also with Angie from the Undeniable Vixen, and she's also part of the Pink Boot Society North Texas. We all had the idea to invite a few women in Brazil who are in the craft beer world and do kind of a virtual happy hour. So we were really excited about this event. It happened back in August. And at first, we wanted to do it in April. We wanted to do kind of like a hybrid event that would be like a virtual happy hour, but we'd also have an event here where I am in Texas right now. But that fell through. And so we're like, let's just do it all virtual. And it actually gave us some time to kind of like walk through some of the logistics and then make it a much more kind of equitable event. And so my presentation today is actually based on some of the lessons that we learned from this event. It was a really just lively event. I think we had between 20 and 30 participants from the United States and Brazil. We put a lot of work, like I said, into the logistics of the event and making it equitable for everybody. And so afterwards, we were like, we have to organize more events like this. We have to kind of like make this one of our models of engaging with our publics. So so yeah, so this was actually the flyer of the event. As you can see, we did the flyer both in English and Portuguese. We advertised it on Instagram, on Facebook, and we had a really great group of women from Brazil. So I lived in Brazil. Like I said, I did my research in Brazil. I lived in Brazil off and on since 2010. And then I just actually recently moved back to Texas, DFW, Dallas, Fort Worth, which is where I'm from. But I was back and forth between Brazil and Texas for like 11 years. And so I lived in Rio de Janeiro at first, and then I went up to the northern part of Brazil, which is the Amazon region of Brazil. And I was kind of like floating around these different craft beer scenes in both places. And whenever I would travel within Brazil, and I would also go like check out the craft beer scenes in other cities in Brazil. And so eventually, I got to know people either personally or online. So, so yeah, so I was like, okay, who should I invite for this event? Who are some badass women that I know in the craft beer industry in Brazil that could talk about these issues of diversity, inclusion, equity. And so we reached out to a few women that we know. So one of the women is Madu Victorino, and she is part of a group called Pretas Cervejeiras, which is a small kind of informal group, or they were informal. Now they're actually a legalized like business, an LLC. of Black women who just love beer. They meet around beer, they talk about beer, they study beer, and they're based out of Rio de Janeiro. And Madhu, she's actually a sommelier, and so I think she just got her certificate maybe like a few months ago. And so she's just like super knowledgeable. She knows like all the technical aspects of beer. She's actually like a scientist. I forget what her degree is actually, but she came into beer through science at first, and then she got into like the more serving, the more some of the other aspects of beer. Um, and so another person that we invited, her name is Jessica Leighton, and she is actually the owner and the founder of a brewery in Belém, which is one of the largest cities in the Amazon region of Brazil. Um, and then the last person that we invited, her name is Bruna Borges. And she is one of the members of Lupulindas, which is a group of women similar to Pretas Cervejeiras, who study beer, who just meet up and drink beer, who talk about beer all the time, also in Belém, in the Amazon region of Brazil. And I was the mediator of the conversation. And so, like I said, we organized the event as a virtual happy hour. So, we had like a list of questions, but also we had two different featured beers. And this is something that I'll talk about later about logistics and just international logistics and having this kind of event. Because we kind of thought, okay, well, we want to choose beers that kind of fall in line with our collective mission, which is to highlight women in beer, but also we wanted to choose beers that highlighted different flavors that are from Brazil, right? And so it was a lot of research to actually choose these beers because both of the beers had to be available in the United States and Brazil, right? And so the beers that we ended up choosing were really interesting. And then we did like a whole tasting with Madhu. And then the participants of the virtual happy hour kind of got to understand how to talk about beer and how to taste beer. And so the two beers were Sierra Nevada Wild Little Thing Sour Ale, and the other one was Japa's, which is it's a Japanese Brazilian brewery, and it was a Sanuki. The name is Sanuki Maru, and it was a hazy IPA. So we had a really great time. Like I said, I'll go into some of the logistics and what that really says about these kinds of exchanges, international exchanges, a little bit later. So I think a lot of times whenever I talk about Brazil, people are kind of like, well, Brazil and beer, people are kind of like, why Brazil? Because I think a lot of times Brazil isn't looked at as a country that is kind of like a hub for craft beer. I think a lot of people think about Brazil as like partying and like beer, but like more like commercial beers that you drink it during carnival or like on the beach, and like people don't really drink to taste, but they drink kind of like to be in party mode, right? To get drunk. Excuse me. But really, Brazil is it's a really interesting case in the craft beer world globally. And so I kind of wanted to organize some data to talk about that a little bit more. So so in Brazil has a third highest total consumption of beer. So this is not per capita, not what each person drinks per year, but like highest consumption in liters per year, and that's after China and the United States. So per capita usually is kind of like European countries, like Eastern European countries, Germany, Czechoslovakia, but it has the third highest total consumption of beer in the world, and that consumption represents 6.6% of the global market share of beer. So, but in terms of craft beer is kind of a recent phenomenon in Brazil. So, as of 2020, there were 1,383 breweries in total, but that includes a lot of that are craft breweries in 2020. And that was a 14.4% growth from 2019, the number of breweries in 2019. And so something that's really interesting about Brazil too is that they have what are called cigana, or maybe what we would call maybe like aroma breweries. And so they're brands of beers that use um, other other breweries to produce their beer. And so, in other words, the brand doesn't have their own brewery, doesn't have their own production, but they kind of like have this more communal system of producing beer. And so So actually in the number 1,383, obviously that doesn't include the 2,000 Cigana breweries. And so all that being said, that there's a lot of production of craft beer in Brazil that's not formalized. People don't have their own space, but for sure it's popular. A lot of it's just, we don't have numbers for it. And so, like I said, craft beer is kind of like, it's relatively new in Brazil, but the scene is just booming right now. But traditionally, so the market share, this was in 2019, uh, over 59% of the market share of beer production in Brazil was Ambev. And that's actually Anheuser-Busch. So, just regular commercial beers. It's Stella, it's Brahma. What else in Brazil? I want to say it's Skol too, maybe. And then after that, it's Heineken. It's Petropolis, which is also a group of Brazilian breweries, and then others, which represents 4.5% of the market share in Brazil. So that also includes craft breweries, and that does not include Cigana breweries as well. So the scene in Brazil is huge. There's a lot of money involved, but also the market is dominated kind of by these larger multinational brewers. Okay, so this is just a map of the breweries in Brazil. So as you can tell, the southeastern part of Brazil is where most of the breweries are. And that part of Brazil, that includes Sao Paulo, that includes Rio, that includes Porto Alegre. Those are all cities that are mostly that are the most economically integrated, not only within Brazil, but also internationally, right? So Sao Paulo has this huge kind of global economy. Rio also has a huge global economy that's connected to tourism. But as you can tell, let me see if I can, as you can tell, there is a lot of Brazil left over, right? And so you see kind of more production on the coast, but here, which is the Amazon region, and this region here too is very dry, you see fewer breweries. So that's also the region that gets the least amount of attention from the Brazilian government. And there's a lot of inequality in those regions too. And so also there's a lot of kind of regional inequality within Brazil, right? So the southeastern part of Brazil, the southern part of Brazil has a lot of resources, right? Has a lot of money. The cities are more developed. And then in this part of Brazil, in the northern part of Brazil, you see less of that. There's more of an informal economy. There's less jobs. Literacy rates are lower. There's more racism, more sexism, more violence against women, all of that. And so this is actually something that we talked about a lot in our virtual happy hour, right? Is this inequality, this regional inequality. Okay, so I'm going to kind of get into, I separated three different lessons that we learned from this virtual event. And so, these are lessons that we got from this particular event, which was like Brazil and the United States. But I'm hoping to kind of open up this broader conversation about what is global, what is international, what are some global international trends in the craft beer world, right? And what can we learn as, let's say, people who are mostly based in the United States or mostly based in Europe from other countries that are also producing beer and also drinking beer, right? And I'm a huge advocate of these kinds of international exchanges. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, right? And so I'm always learning from other places, other spaces, other cultures. And I truly believe that whenever we look at other places, we're looking in a mirror, right? So sometimes you recognize things in other places that we didn't realize were so prevalent to us, but whenever we see it somewhere else, it's kind of like, oh yeah, there's something wrong with that. We need to fix that. And so that's kind of my context. That's kind of my base for everything. And I think a lot of those themes came out during our virtual happy hour. Okay, so lesson number one was racism, sexism, homophobia, and gender-based violence are global. And really, any kind of discrimination is global, right? And this might not be a surprise for those of us who live it every day, and those of us who travel and experience these things in other countries. But I think it needs to be said, right? And so So another thing I'm going to say that I organized these slides based on some of the quotes from our invited guests for the virtual happy hour, just so you would get an idea of what they were saying from the perspective of Brazil. So I'm just going to read the quotes. So Jessica said, sometimes I, as a female owner of a brewery, many times imbued with mistrust. Jessica also said, I believe that here in Belém, which again, Belém is one of the largest cities in the Amazon region of Brazil, it's still an elite market and majority male. And then Madhu said, we're seeing an increase in women in the craft beer world, but the proportion of Black women is a very small proportion. So, I see a lot of themes that we discuss in the craft beer world in the United States that that women in Brazil, this is on their minds too. This is something that they organize around, right? And so I think another thing that was really interesting too was that whenever we talk about sexism or whenever we talk about racism, we have to talk about all these things together, right? So it's not just that women are discriminated against, but also that Black women are discriminated against even more, right? It was interesting that Madhu said that because Black women are actually the largest demographic in Brazil, right? So Brazil is 54% Black, and so a little over half of that percentage is Black women, right? And so there have been a lot of studies that have come out too, and it's actually obvious whenever you go to Brazil that Black women are a huge part of Brazil's economy, right? Because it's the highest number of workers that there are in Brazil. And so a lot of Black women, of course, work in kind of informal professions, especially like in the urban regions of Brazil, and a lot of them experience exploitation in some kind of way or gender-based violence at work in some kind of way, whether it's sexual or whether it's wage violence, anything like that. And so whenever we talk about these issues, which again are global issues, we need to talk about the intersection of all of these different kinds of identity categories or demographic categories. Um, and then also, whenever we talk about all these issues, we can't look at it as like an isolated kind of issue, right? So we might know that, there's discrimination in one brewery. We might know that there's a lot of discrimination, one metro area or even one country. But whenever we really look at it globally and we kind of connect with other people in other countries, it makes us much more powerful, right? I mean, we can mobilize a little bit better. We have more data, for instance, and we have more leverage to actually do what we need to do. And one thing that I always like to say too is like, it's great to have grassroots movements. It's great to have collectives of women who are mobilizing around this. But at the same time, workplace violence there are international regulations around workplace violence that the UN has had in place for decades now. And so, we can't treat them like, they're issues that we alone can tackle, but there's issues that are on the radar internationally always. Um, so also another thing that I thought was really interesting about these prejudices and these violences being global is that a lot of times we kind of have misconceptions about other places, right? So I know one misconception about Brazil is that Brazil is kind of like this melting pot, like a kind of mixed paradise, and there's no real racism because everyone just kind of mixes together. But that's not true. There's definitely a racial hierarchy in Brazil, right? And so, there are a lot of US tourists that go to Brazil. We need to be mindful of that whenever we go to Brazil, right? We need to be mindful of, who we're buying craft beer from, what kinds of where our money is going, if it's supporting kind of like these discriminatory markets, or are we trying to go to like, let's say, women-owned restaurants, Black-owned restaurants, or just other, like, let's say, minority-owned restaurants, and helping their business, right? It was really awesome too, just kind of as a side note, to see, there were quite a few Black women, but just women in general in our virtual happy hour, and just kind of like seeing everyone's face light up whenever the women in Brazil started to talk about their experiences. And I think the women in the United States kind of felt less alone. It was kind of like, okay, well, this is happening somewhere else. We're not the ones. We're not just making it up. This is something that it's a global kind of trend. Okay, so the next lesson that we learned is that we definitely need to discuss cultural imperialism. So one of the first comments that came up during the virtual happy hour was that U.S. styles of craft beer dominate in Brazil, right? And so a lot of the craft breweries are trying to kind of reach this. I want to say it's a level, but trying to maybe copy that market, right? The U.S. market. And so something that all three women actually brought up a lot is like, hey, Brazil, we have our own styles, we have our own culture, and we have our own tradition of fermented drinks. And yes, beer that we really should tap into. So I'm going to read the quotes. Brazil is a country of continental proportions, Madhu said. Excuse me. And Brazil has a big tradition of fermented drinks of indigenous origin. We should also look at what we make traditionally here, take that knowledge that indigenous peoples have already been producing for a long time, and integrate that into our beers, also Madhu. And then Bruna said, Brazil truly has biodiversity. Our culture, our creativity, I believe, has a lot to add to the craft beer market, principally women. And so we all thought that was really interesting, right? So like all the participants from the United States were like, wait a second, what are some of the flavors? Like, we're aware of some fruits that we might consider tropical in the United States, right? So let's say guava, passion fruit, even pineapple, what else? But there were so many other fruits that the women in the virtual happy hour from Brazil mentioned, right? And also a few different production styles, like for instance, something that was really interesting to a lot of people was that in the Amazon region, people use like fermented cassava juice as like a seasoning. And at some point, people were actually making craft beer out of that, the fermented cassava juice, right? And so there are so many different traditions within Brazil that the women on the panel were like, well, why are we so focused on kind of like American styles whenever there's so much we could pull from in Brazil, right? And so I thought that was really interesting because it kind of points to a broader conversation about, like whenever we're thinking about like which styles are most valued, which styles should we make available in a market, which styles should we learn how to make. It's like, which styles matter, which styles dominate, which styles have the most value, right? Um, and then let's see, here. And then kind of like stemming off of that too is this cultural appropriation of Brazil. So this is something that came up actually when we were researching which beers we should highlight. There were a lot of beers, a lot of breweries that had some kind of, like, at least by the label or by the name of the beer, said that they had some kind of connection with Brazil, right, or some kind of like tropical kind of art or some kind of tropical theme. But whenever we actually did the research, there was no connection with Brazil at all, right? I mean, there weren't actual Brazilian brewers involved. Sometimes there weren't even like real fruits or real flavors used. It was kind of just like, inspired by the flavor of guava, that kind of thing. Um, and on the other hand, there are a few breweries that are trying to break, a few Brazilian breweries, I would say, they're trying to break into the United States market, but because of taxes, because of all kinds of other laws and policies, and because of just not having those networks, they're having a hard time breaking into the market. And so that's one of the reasons that we chose Japas, actually, because they are definitely from Brazil. It has a whole story about Japanese immigration to Brazil, and yeah, it's authentically Brazilian. That was actually really hard to find. Um, there was one beer that actually used the name of an indigenous group in Brazil, in the Amazon region of Brazil. But whenever we actually did research about it, the people weren't from the region at all. And it was actually hard to find that beer in Brazil. It was mostly marketed to a US audience. And so there's a lot of appropriation that goes on between the United States and Brazil. And that's something that, it shows that inequality doesn't just happen with, let's say, identity groups, right? It shows that inequality is also kind of, it's imperialistic, right? So there's this relationship of dominance with the United States, and Brazil kind of being like on the back burner, kind of being like the economic backyard of the United States, right? And so it's something that I think as people who are mostly based in the United States, we need to have a lot of consciousness about, right? We need to be more careful with that. And then another kind of note about this too is, whenever we organize international events, we have to be really careful about things like translation, things about simultaneous um, interpretation as well. We have to make sure that whenever we talk about equity, whenever we talk about inclusion, we're talking about all of the above, right? We're thinking about factors such as internet speed. We're thinking about factors such as like having a decent place to do a virtual happy hour for an hour or more. We're thinking about all these different factors, right? And that's something that came up. That's something I'll talk about next, actually. Um, a lot in our virtual happy hour. It took a lot of just logistical planning, thinking about, how we would get an audience from Brazil and from the United States. And it wouldn't just turn into something that was like, people from Brazil speaking and then United people from the United States being spectators, right? We wanted to actually have like an interaction. Okay, so lesson three is something that I've alluded to several times. So the devil is in the logistics and the planning, right? And so something that I always like to say and something that I always think about is, we live in societies that are governed by inequitable structures, right? And they're inequitable structures that are pretty fixed. They've been around for a long time, and it's really easy for us to fall into these structures. So whenever we think about, creating a more inclusive world, creating a more diverse world, creating a more just world, we actually have to think about the small things that we fall into that kind of perpetuate this inequity, right? And so that's something that came up a lot, like with our technology for this virtual happy hour, right? So so we had to really think through like interpretation. For instance, we couldn't just have one interpreter, we had to have two interpreters. We had to be really sure to talk to the interpreters before about what kinds of themes would come up, right? So that whenever they interpreted, they would be able to actually communicate in like a critical way some of the issues that we were talking about, right? And so yeah, that was just about the virtual happy hour, but also there were all kinds of other kind of logistical things that the panelists talked about. So let me read the quotes. So Bruna said, "Free shipping for all of Brazil minus the north." And this is something that came up constantly in our virtual happy hour, that um, that in the northern part of Brazil, there's kind of like this idea that it's so isolated and so far from the rest of Brazil that, like you'll be buying craft beer online and it'll say free shipping for all of Brazil, but really they mean that the southern part, that map that I showed at the beginning, the southeast part of Brazil, which is kind of like the economic center of Brazil, right? And so that's actually just ordering craft beer. But for instance, with brewers, it's hard for them to get equipment. It's hard for them to get ingredients too. A lot of the ingredients aren't from Brazil. A lot of the ingredients are actually from the United States, which makes the cost even higher. There are so many kind of logistical factors that make it extremely difficult for people in the northern part of Brazil to even make beer, to even produce beer. Um, and so a lot of that is again that kind of like regional inequality that I was talking about, right? So there's regional inequality. There are women who are in this industry in the northern part of Brazil, but if women already are marginalized economically, right? But if all of these costs come up of taxes, of transportation, and they want to make beer, it just makes it so much more difficult for them to make beer, right? And so they're structurally kind of shut out of the process of making beer. Um, and then Madhu said, part of the problem is an insertion in the educational part of craft beer. Access is very limited, the costs are high, the information is expensive, and many times we don't have access. And so again, it's, I think for a lot of women, and a lot of women in Brazil are working too, working women, the costs just don't, they're too high for them to get really involved with the craft beer industry. And so again, it's a way to structurally kind of shut out people. And so whenever we think about inclusion and we think about like diversity, we need to think about simple things like that, right? So even if, let's say, even if some kind of training, some kind of craft beer training, some kind of certificate is all online, does a person have fast enough internet? Does a person have a working computer? Again, does a person have a space where they can just calmly watch a class for however many hours per day, right? We need to think about those kinds of things. Is the schedule of the class really strict, or do you already have pre-recorded sessions for people who work during the day or who work at night? And so whenever we think about inclusion, we need to think about those small factors, those small logistical kind of factors. And then Jessica said we could provide consulting for some of the bars in Belém about how to treat women and organize some efforts so that we don't feel uncomfortable. So again, this is planning, right? And there have been several initiatives now, especially in the last year in the United States, safe bars, trying to think about this aspect of space. If you are someone who, let's say, is not um, a white heteronormative male and you enter into a bar, what's going to make you feel safe, right? It could be little things like music. It could be how bathrooms are labeled. It could be, I know recently there's been a push from a lot of bars, like, hey, say this word if you feel uncomfortable. It could be things like that. How many exits are there in the bar, right? So if someone feels unsafe, do they have to do they only have one exit to go through, or do they have another exit that may be a little bit farther away that no one doesn't? I mean, there's so many different factors that we can think about, right? A lot of that is it's logistics, it's planning, but it's also communication, right? It's something that we have to kind of open up to everybody, and not just in a virtual happy hour, not just, let's say, in one single session in a virtual event or something, but this is something that we have to have as a continuing kind of conversation. So just to kind of to wrap up, I thought this was a pretty short presentation. I was really hoping to have more comments, but like I said, I'm happy to have this conversation elsewhere after the conference as well. But something that overall we really learned is that as collectives, as grassroots collectives, we have a lot of power, right? And whenever I say grassroots, I mean, they're usually small collectives of people, in this case, women. And, we might not have any kind of formal organizational structure. Sometimes we do, right? But usually we're not connected like to any kind of corporation or anything, right? And we have a little bit more flexibility with the kind of events that we can organize and kind of conversations that we can have, right? So I believe in the power of these types of collectives. I think we have a lot of economic power. I think, for instance, if there is a group of women in Brazil or a group of women in the United States, right, and they want to make craft beer and they want to ship that craft beer out, or they want to ask someone if they have a specific any kind of specific kind of ingredient. I believe that through grassroots collectives, through economic collectives, we can make that happen in a way that's more accessible than it's happening right now, right? There are a lot of kind of larger companies that are controlling this whole larger companies and larger force that are kind of controlling this whole flux of things, right? But there are enough of us where we could truly get together and organize, right? We have a lot of economic power, we have a lot of communicative power. A lot of us we love craft beer, but some of us are lawyers, some of us are anthropologists, some of us are chemists, some of us are economists, some of us, are journalists. And I believe that we all could come together and kind of have a more equitable, let's say, a more equitable supply chain, right? And a safer kind of environment for all of us to enjoy craft beer. So yeah. So if anyone wants to reach out to me or look at some of my work, here's all my contacts. You can send me an email, you can send me a message on Instagram, whatever you want. And then the virtual happy hour guests that I mentioned, please look them up on Instagram. Bruna, like I said, is part of the group Lupulindas. Jessica is the owner of a brewery called Ribolca. And then Madhu, she is one of the founders of Preta Cervejeiras. And she also posts a lot of educational kinds of material, I think on her, well, definitely on the group Instagram, but on her own Instagram as well. So yeah, please reach out to them. Please reach out to me. If you have any questions, comments, if you want to organize an event, please reach out. Okay, discussion, but I don't know if anyone's here. So I'll just save the discussion for later, for another time. All right, bye. Enjoy the rest of the conference.